Welcome, dear listeners, to this special sanctuary of silence where we allow our thoughts to drift freely and our hearts to find their calm. Tonight's story we dedicate to one of the most magnificent figures in the history of humankind, a brilliant thinker whose ideas, born in ancient Hellas, continue to illuminate our path, even today. We will be speaking of Plato. Prepare for a journey that will transcend the bounds of time and space. We will not simply recount dry facts, but will instead try to feel the very pulse of the era in which Plato lived. We will immerse ourselves in the world of his youth, learn of his meeting with the wise Socrates, which forever changed his life, and of the tragic events that compelled Plato to seek truth and justice. We will follow his path in the quest for knowledge and bear witness to the founding of the first academy in history, a place where wisdom itself was born. In this philosophical lullaby, we will touch upon the key ideas of Plato, which come alive in his immortal dialogues. We will uncover his striving for the ideal, an aspiration that permeated all his thoughts, from the understanding of true beauty to the dream of a perfect state. Let these stories, like a gentle whisper, immerse you in the world of ancient philosophy, grant you inner peace, and allow your mind to rest. Let go of the day's concerns, for wisdom reveals itself best in the quiet of the night. Tonight, we embark on a fascinating journey not only to the sources of profound ideas, but to the very heart of the ancient world, to ancient Hellas, the cradle of Western civilization, and in particular to Athens, the city that became the cradle of democracy, philosophy, and art. It was in this unique atmosphere, among majestic temples, bustling agoras, and fervent debates, that one of the greatest thinkers of all time was born and created his life's work, Plato. To fully grasp the genius of Plato, to feel the depth of his ideas, we must immerse ourselves in the world that surrounded him. Imagine the 5th century before our era, an epoch rightly named the Golden Age of Athens, or the Age of Pericles. It was a time of incredible flourishing in all spheres of life, but at the same time, a period of intense political and social change that directly influenced the formation of Plato's worldview. Hellas, this was not a single state in our modern understanding. It was a collection of hundreds of independent polis, city-states, each with its own laws, government, traditions, and even dialects. What united them was a common origin, a common language, albeit with regional variations, the shared gods of Olympus, and of course the great Pan-Hellenic games, such as the Olympics. It was a world of fierce competition and frequent conflict, but at the same time, a world of intense cultural exchange, where ideas circulated freely, enriching one another. In this vibrant world, Athens held a special place. After the victory over the Persians in the Greco-Persian Wars, 499 BC, Athens became the most powerful and influential polis. It led the Delian League, which transformed into the Athenian Maritime Empire, bringing incredible wealth to the city. These funds were used for large-scale construction that turned Athens into a true jewel of Hellas. Picture the Athenian Acropolis, a sacred rock, crowned with majestic temples, rising above the city, gleaming with the white of marble under the ardent Greek sun. The Parthenon, dedicated to the goddess Athena, was not only an architectural masterpiece, but also a symbol of the power and piety of the Athenians. Nearby, the Aratheon, the Propylaea, the temple of Nike Apteros, every stone of which told a story of glory and faith. Below the Acropolis, in the center of the city, lay the Agora, the bustling heart of public life. This was not merely a marketplace, but the very pulse of Athens. Here merchants traded, politicians debated, orators spoke, friends met, and philosophers, like Socrates, tirelessly conducted their dialogues. compelling their companions to ponder the deepest questions of existence. The Athens of Plato was a democratic state, though not in our modern sense. The right to vote was held only by adult free male citizens, while women, foreigners, medics, and slaves were deprived of this right. However, for its time, it was an exceedingly progressive system. Citizens took direct part in governance, sat in the People's Assembly, the ecclesia, voted on laws, elected officials, and even participated in courts, which consisted of large panels of jurors. It is this direct democracy, with all its advantages and flaws, that would become one of the central themes in Plato's philosophy as he critically assessed its forms, especially after the tragic death of his teacher Socrates, who was condemned by democratic Athens. During this period, art and drama blossomed. The Athenians adored the theater, not simply as entertainment, but as an important part of religious and educational life. The tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, the comedies of Aristophanes, all of this shaped moral conceptions and civic values. Sculpture, painting, and architecture reached unprecedented heights, embodying the ideal of harmony, proportion, and beauty, which would later find its reflection in Plato's aesthetic views. Education was exceptionally important, although there were no formal schools in the modern sense. Young Athenians were taught literacy, music, and gymnastics. Athenian intellectuals, particularly sophists, offered training in rhetoric, the art of persuasion, which was vitally important for success in a democratic society. However, Plato, like his teacher Socrates, was critical of the sophists, believing they taught only the art of persuasion rather than true knowledge and virtue. This was a world permeated by mythology and religion. The Olympian gods, Zeus, Athena, Apollo, were not just characters from tales, but real forces that influenced people's lives. Temples, sacrifices, festivals, all were an integral part of daily existence. Yet in parallel with traditional beliefs, philosophy was being born and developed, an attempt at a rational understanding of the world, the cosmos, humanity, and morality. It was this very environment where old myths coexisted with new intellectual quests that became the fertile ground for the emergence of a thinker such as Plato. And so, as we delve into the life and ideas of Plato, remember this bright, turbulent, and yet harmonious world, a world where Athens shone as a beacon of civilization, but where political passions also seethed, where philosophy was born from dialogue, and where the search for truth was not merely an academic pursuit, but a vital necessity of life. This is the context in which Plato formed his grand theories of ideas, of the state, of justice, and of the immortality of the soul, ideas that still resonate in the hearts of people all across the world. After we have immersed ourselves in the atmosphere of ancient Hellas and felt the pulse of life in its heart, Athens, the time has come to focus on the central figure of our journey, Plato. To better understand his thoughts and philosophy, it is important first to become acquainted with him as a person, to learn of his origins and his first steps in this world. Plato was born in Athens around the year 48 or 40 BC. This was a time, as we have mentioned, that followed the devastating Peloponnesian War, a time when society was searching for new bearings and old values were being called into question. But despite the general instability, his birth took place within a circle where entirely different moods and possibilities prevailed. Plato's origins and family connections were truly exceptional. He belonged to one of the most noble and influential Athenian families. His father, Aristotle, traced his lineage back to Codrus himself, the mythical king of Athens who was considered one of the city's founders. This connection to a royal line did not just grant him high social status, it was a symbol of antiquity and nobility, deeply revered in Athenian society. On his mother's side, through Pryxene. Plato was related to another distinguished Athenian family. Her ancestor was Solon, the great lawgiver, one of the seven sages of Greece, whose reforms laid the foundations of Athenian democracy. These family ties gave Plato not only certain advantages, such as access to the best education and social life, but also placed upon him certain duties. It was believed that members of such families were meant to serve the state, dedicating themselves to politics and public affairs. Therefore, from a young age, Plato was raised in an atmosphere where valor, wisdom, and service to the polis were cherished. He was surrounded by people who were active participants in political life, and from childhood he observed their conversations, their aspirations, and their disappointments. Thus, in his first steps and initial aspirations, the young Plato was a typical representative of the Athenian aristocracy. He likely dreamed of a career in politics, which was a natural path for men of his circle. He received the finest education of his time. He studied grammar, music, poetry, and gymnastics. Physical training was no less important than intellectual development, as the harmonious cultivation of body and spirit was considered the ideal. It is said that thanks to his strong build and broad shoulders, he received his nickname Plato, which means the broad or broad-shouldered. His real name, according to some sources, was Aristocles. This nickname, which stayed with him forever, became a symbol not only of his physical strength, but also of the breadth of his mind, his capacity to encompass vast expanses of thought. The young Plato also showed considerable talent for poetry. There is evidence that he wrote tragedies and epigrams, and perhaps even intended to devote himself to drama, as other prominent Athenians had done. Imagine him, young and full of vigor, sitting in the Athenian theater, watching the plays of the great tragedians, and dreaming of creating similar masterpieces himself. His soul was sensitive to the beauty of the word, to rhythm, to the harmony that is the foundation of all art. However, despite all these initial ambitions and talents, Plato's destiny, as we shall see, was to take an unexpected turn. Although he belonged to an elite that had every chance of a successful political career, something internal, something profound, was leading him down another path. His mind sought answers to more fundamental questions than those discussed in political assemblies. This search, though perhaps unconscious at first, gradually began to prevail over all other ambitions. And so, when we reflect on Plato, we see not just an abstract philosopher from the distant past, but a young man with his own dreams, his own talents, and his own place in society. His origins and youth created the unique soil upon which his great philosophy would later blossom. He was a product of his time and his environment, but at the same time, his genius allowed him to transcend their limits, creating ideas that continue to illuminate our world to this day. Continuing our quiet narrative, we now approach the moment that became a true watershed in the life of the young Plato, an event that forever altered his destiny and the entire course of Western thought. He was a young man from a noble family, talented, and perhaps even ambitious in a political sense, as was customary in his circle. But Athens, as we already know, was a city teeming with ideas, where at every turn one could meet extraordinary people who asked unsettling questions. And so one day, on one of the bustling Athenian squares or in a gymnasium where young men competed in strength and eloquence, Plato met the man who would become his teacher and mentor, Socrates. Socrates was truly unusual. He was not like the other philosophers or sophists of his time. He did not deliver lectures in grand halls, did not charge a fee for his teaching, and did not write books. Instead, he simply walked the streets of Athens, in the agora and the workshops of artisans, in the homes of aristocrats, and he asked questions. These questions seemed simple at first glance, but like sharp instruments, they penetrated to the very essence of things, forcing his interlocutors to reflect on what they had considered obvious. The young Plato, who was perhaps searching for the meaning of his life, or maybe was simply intrigued by the rumors about this strange sage, was profoundly struck by his encounter with Socrates. He, like many other young Athenians, became his student and listener. This was not merely an educational interaction, it was a spiritual kinship that went beyond the ordinary relationship of a teacher and a student. Plato sensed in Socrates not just a teacher, but a guide to true knowledge, to a true life. It was this very encounter that became the turning point in Plato's life. It changed his views on life and turned him away from politics in favor of the philosophical quest. Although he belonged to an aristocratic lineage and had every chance for a successful political career, which men of his background traditionally chose, the meeting with Socrates opened another path to him, the path of serving truth, not power. Socrates showed him that true wealth lies not in material possessions or political might, but in wisdom and virtue. He taught Plato to question everything that seemed obvious, to seek the deep meaning in every concept, in every action. This meeting with Socrates was not just a moment of enlightenment, it became a symbol of a shift in priorities. For Plato, as for many others who conversed with Socrates, politics, which was filled with intrigue and injustice, lost its appeal. He saw that true strength lies not in the ability to manipulate people, but in the ability to see the truth, in the ability to govern oneself. This encounter marked the beginning of his own unique philosophical journey, where he was destined not only to preserve the ideas of his teacher, but also to develop them, to create his own magnificent philosophical system. Plato saw in Socrates the embodiment of wisdom, a man who lived in accordance with his convictions, unafraid of challenges and never retreating from the truth. For him, this was the example of a true philosopher, one who seeks truth not for personal gain, but for the good of society. It was under the influence of Socrates that Plato definitively chose the path of the philosopher, a path that demanded considerable courage and self-dedication. This fateful meeting, which took place on the streets of ancient Athens, became the spark that ignited the fire of philosophical thought in Plato's soul, a fire that still burns today, illuminating the path for many generations. The encounter with Socrates, as we now know, was not merely an acquaintance for Plato, but a true revelation that transformed his entire worldview. Yet it is worth remembering that Socrates himself left behind no writings whatsoever. He did not sit at a table meticulously tracing letters onto papyrus or clay tablets to etch his thoughts for posterity. His philosophy was oral, living, and dynamic. He was convinced that true knowledge is born only in the process of a living dialogue, in direct communion between people. For him, the written word was lifeless. It could not answer questions. It could not adapt to its interlocutor. A written speech, as Socrates said, cannot defend itself nor help the one who wrote it. He believed that true knowledge must be deeply rooted in the soul, not merely lying on the surface, fixed in ink. It is for this very reason that his ideas were transmitted through the students who conversed with him, listened to his discussions, and participated in his dialogues. Socrates was like a spring of pure water that does not collect in a vessel, but flows continuously, nourishing all that is around it. His students, among whom were simple citizens and noble aristocrats and even women, became his voice. They were the ones who absorbed his wisdom, passed it through the prism of their own understanding, and then conveyed it further, often through their own works. This underscores the importance of the oral tradition in ancient Greek philosophy, a tradition where the living word, the exchange of thoughts here and now, was the highest form of cognition. Among all the students of Socrates, it was undoubtedly Plato who became the principal guardian of his teacher's ideas, his most distinguished voice, which has resonated through the centuries. One could say that without Plato, we would know far less about Socrates, as the majority of information about him has reached us precisely through Plato's dialogues. He did not simply retell his teacher's words, he breathed new life into them, crafting them into an artistic form where the drama of the situation and the characters' personalities help to more deeply reveal the philosophical ideas. In his dialogues, Plato did not merely record Socrates' conversations, he developed them, supplemented them, and contemplated them through the prism of his own brilliant mind. In the early dialogues, such as the Apology of Socrates or Crito, we see a Socrates who is very close to the historical figure, one who fights for truth, accepts an unjust verdict, and demonstrates an unbreakable spirit. But in later works, for instance, in the Republic or the Phaedo, Socrates becomes more of a mouthpiece for Plato's own philosophical ideas, as Plato placed into the mouth of his teacher his own deepest reflections on the world of ideas, the immortality of the soul, and the ideal society. This connection between Socrates and Plato is like a bridge between two eras of thought. Socrates laid the foundations. He posed the fundamental questions that compelled the Athenians to reflect upon their values. He was the one who first systematically focused on ethical questions, on self-knowledge, on the importance of virtue, and Plato, in his turn, took these seeds of thought and grew from them the magnificent tree of his philosophical system, expanding them from ethics to metaphysics, epistemology, and politics. Plato's use of the dialogue form was not accidental. He saw in it the ideal way to preserve the living breath of Socrates' philosophical conversation. His dialogues are not dry treatises, but true literary works, filled with drama, humor, and vivid characters. Reading them, we feel as though we ourselves become participants in those ancient conversations. We hear the voices, see the emotions, and sense the intellectual tension. This allows the ideas of Socrates and subsequently those of Plato to be more accessible and understandable to readers across the centuries. Thus, Plato became not just a student, but also a co-author who immortalized the dialogues of Socrates to preserve them for future generations. He understood the value of what he had received from his teacher and felt a responsibility to ensure that this wisdom would not vanish, would not dissolve into oblivion. It was an act of profound respect and gratitude. It is thanks to Plato that we today, across millennia, can touch the thought of Socrates, feel his striving for truth, and understand his method of knowing. In this tranquil immersion into the world of ancient thought, we can feel how the legacy of the teacher continues to live within the student. The ideas of Socrates, contemplated and developed by Plato, became not just history, they became a living part of our cultural heritage. This serves as a reminder of how knowledge is passed from generation to generation, how sparks of wisdom are lit one from another, creating an unbroken chain of cognition. We have delved into the story of the connection between the teacher and the student, between Socrates and Plato, understanding how vital his mentor's oral legacy was to Plato. However, this story had its tragic, yet profoundly influential epilogue, the death of Socrates. This event was not merely a personal loss for Plato, it proved to be a deep wound for him, one that left an indelible mark upon his soul and radically influenced the formation of his philosophical views. Around the year 3099 BC, when Plato was about 28 years old, Socrates was accused of impiety, of not worshiping the gods of Athens, and of corrupting the youth. These accusations were in essence merely a pretext. The true reason was that Socrates, with his critical irony and his unsettling questions challenged the authority of the powerful, compelled people to ponder true values, and shattered the illusions of Athenian society. He exposed the ignorance of those who considered themselves wise, and this provoked irritation and fear. The trial of Socrates was a political farce, although it was conducted with adherence to formal procedures. In the famous Apology of Socrates, written by Plato, we see how Socrates calmly and with dignity defends himself. He does not ask for mercy, nor does he try to flatter the judges. Instead, he defends his way of life, his service to the truth. His mission is defined by a divine sign to stir the Athenians towards self knowledge and the search for virtue. He explains that his activity was a benefit to the city, for he, like a gadfly, was waking Athens from its intellectual slumber. Despite his persuasive arguments and the greatness of his spirit, the jurors, succumbing to the mood of the crowd and political pressure, delivered an unjust verdict: the death penalty. The courage of Socrates in the face of death was astounding. He refused the chance to escape, which his friends offered him, believing that to break the laws, even unjust ones, would be a betrayal of his own principles. He calmly drank the cup of hemlock, the poison that was the method of execution in Athens. The final hours of his life, described by Plato in the dialogue Phaedo, were dedicated to philosophical conversations about the immortality of the soul. To his very last breath, he remained true to his convictions, demonstrating an absolute harmony between his words and his deeds. This death of his teacher became a profound trauma for Plato. He was a witness to the injustice that befell the wisest and most virtuous man he had ever known. This event deeply disillusioned him with Athenian democracy, which, in his view, had proven itself capable of condemning its finest citizen in death. For Plato, this was proof that a society governed not by wisdom, but by the opinion of the crowd, is doomed to decline and injustice. He saw how politics, which ought to serve the good, had devolved into an arena of intrigue, where truth and justice were powerless. This tragedy intensified his disappointment with Athenian democracy and became a powerful impetus for his search for an ideal society, one where wisdom would be held above all else. Plato understood that to avoid similar tragedies in the future, it was necessary to change the very foundations of the state structure. He came to the conclusion that a state must be governed not by the random decisions of the majority, but by reason, wisdom, and knowledge. This conviction became the cornerstone of his political philosophy, which would later find its fullest expression in his treatise, The Republic. It was this event, the death of Socrates, that ultimately solidified in Plato the idea that truth and justice must have absolute foundations, that they cannot depend on the shifting moods of society or the interests of particular groups. He sought to find these unshakable foundations that would become the basis for an ideal world. For him, the death of Socrates was not only a personal grief, but also a symbol of the danger of ignorance and irrationality in society. It underscored the necessity for philosophers, those who see the truth, to govern the state, for only they are capable of ensuring the true good. This bitter truth experienced by Plato formed his deep conviction in the need for fundamental changes. It was not merely an emotional shock, but an intellectual challenge that spurred him to create a great philosophical system, one that was meant to prevent the recurrence of similar tragedies. This became his mission, to not allow wisdom to be condemned to death ever again. After the shadow of tragedy fell upon Athens, taking the life of its wisest son, Plato, deeply shaken and disillusioned, understood to remain in a city where truth had been condemned and wisdom punished by death was impossible. The death of Socrates was not merely a source of grief, it transformed into an impulse to act, a powerful catalyst for his own path. He had to leave Athens, to find answers to the questions that now burned within his soul with a new intensity. The reasons for and directions of Plato's travels were multifaceted. Firstly, there was the matter of simple safety. Although he was not directly accused along with Socrates, his close association with his teacher could have made him the next target. The political atmosphere in Athens was tense, and Plato's profound disappointment in the Athenian democracy, which had allowed such an injustice, left him with no desire to participate in the city's public life. He realized that in order to build an ideal society, one must first understand how it ought to function, and for this, experience that extended beyond the borders of his native polis was required. Secondly, it was a yearning for new knowledge. Plato, though a student of Socrates, understood that his philosophy must evolve, be enriched by new ideas and perspectives. He felt that the knowledge he had acquired in Athens was only one part of a great puzzle. To assemble the full picture, it was necessary to go beyond the familiar, to see other cultures, other ways of thinking, other philosophical schools that could offer new answers to the eternal questions. He was not merely an adventurer, but a true wanderer, thirsting for knowledge. Although the exact route of his travels is shrouded in legend and not always confirmed by reliable sources, it is believed that Plato visited the following regions. Megara. After the death of Socrates, he likely first went to Megara, where he took refuge with his friend and fellow student Euclid of Megara, who was also a Socratic and had founded the Megarian school of philosophy. This was a period of mourning and of contemplating his loss. Egypt. Some sources claim that Plato traveled to Egypt, which at that time was considered the cradle of ancient wisdom. There he could have become acquainted with Egyptian mathematics, astronomy, religious beliefs, and mystical knowledge. Although there is no direct evidence of his stay in Egypt, the influence of Egyptian culture on Greek philosophy was significant, and it is not out of the question that Plato sought to study these sources directly. Italy and Sicily. Magna Graecia. This was perhaps the most important part of his travels, one that had a profound influence on his philosophy. In southern Italy and Sicily, Greek colonies thrived and were centers of Pythagoreanism, a philosophical school that paid special attention to mathematics, music, astronomy, and the belief in the immortality and transmigration of the soul. Plato had the opportunity to converse directly with Pythagoreans, such as Archytas of Turnum, who was not only a philosopher, but also a distinguished mathematician and politician. It was likely from the Pythagoreans that Plato adopted a deep faith in the importance of mathematics as the key to understanding the cosmos, as well as the ideas of the world's numerical harmony. Syracuse. Plato made 3 journeys to Sicily, to the court of the tyrant of Syracuse, Dionysius the Elder, and later his son Dionysius the Younger. These journeys were driven by Plato's hope of putting his philosophical ideas about the ideal state into practice by educating a ruler to become a philosopher king. Although these attempts ended in failure and even posed a danger to Plato's life, they provided him with invaluable experience in real politics and confirmed his conviction that only a true philosopher is capable of effectively governing a state. These journeys, filled with adventures, encounters, and disappointments, contributed to an incredible enrichment of Plato's worldview. Every new land, every meeting with other thinkers, every philosophical school with which he became acquainted, broadened his horizons and the depth of his understanding. He had the opportunity to compare different philosophical systems, political structures, and religious beliefs. He saw how people in other cultures lived and thought, and what values they professed. His acquaintance with the mathematical knowledge of the Pythagoreans, their belief that numbers lie at the foundation of all that exists, deeply influenced Plato. He began to view mathematics not just as a science of numbers, but as a path to understanding the unchanging, eternal ideas, the basis of his famous theory of ideas. This journey was not merely a physical displacement, it was an internal growth, a rethinking, a crystallization of his own philosophical views. All of these meetings, discussions, and observations influenced the formation of his own philosophy. He did not simply copy the ideas of others, but reinterpreted them through the prism of his brilliant mind, creating a unique synthetic system. His travels confirmed for him that the world we see is but a pale copy of something more perfect. This period of his life was a time of deep self discovery, when Plato, having distanced himself from the familiar world of Athens, found within himself the strength to create something entirely new and magnificent. And so these travels were not just adventures, but a necessary stage in the formation of Plato as one of the greatest philosophers of all time. They became the foundation upon which he would later build his academy and create his immortal works, which continue to illuminate the path for many generations to this day. After years of travel that had enriched his mind with a diversity of knowledge and experience, after the bitter political disappointments in Syracuse, Plato returned to Athens. This return was not a capitulation or a renunciation of his ideals. On the contrary, it marked the beginning of a new, exceptionally important stage in his life and in the history of Western thought. He arrived not as a disillusioned politician, but as a sage, filled with the determination to realize his ideas in a different way, not through direct participation in politics, but through education. The return to Athens and the goal of the academy were conditioned by Plato's profound realization that true changes in society are possible only through the education and upbringing of wise rulers. He understood that his attempts to influence Dionysius the Younger had been naive, for the tyrant was not ready for true knowledge. Plato concluded that in order to create an ideal state, it is first necessary to create the people who will be capable of building and governing it. Thus arose the idea of founding a new type of educational institution, the academy. Around the year 3087 BC, Plato founded his academy in Athens, in a grove dedicated to the legendary hero Academus, from whence its name is derived. This was not just an educational institution, it was the first institution of higher learning in history, one that functioned systematically and continuously for nearly 1,000 years, until 529 AD, when it was closed by the Emperor Justinian. The academy became a place for the systematic study and research of philosophy and the development of scientific knowledge. It was the first university in the modern sense of the word, one that united around itself the most distinguished minds of that time. The purpose for creating such an establishment was both ambitious and profound. Plato sought not merely to teach students, but to cultivate sages and future rulers, those very same philosopher kings he had dreamed of in his republic. He believed that only those who have comprehended truth, goodness, and beauty, who are able to see the ideal essence of things, can justly and wisely govern a society. The academy was to become a forge for an intellectual and moral elite, capable of transforming the real world by bringing it closer to the ideal one. The educational process and atmosphere at the academy were cardinally different from what had come before. This was not a school of sophists who taught rhetoric for the sake of political success, nor was it simply a place for casual conversations, as had been the case with Socrates. The instruction at the academy was rigorous and sequential. Students studied not only philosophy, which was the heart of the curriculum, but also such disciplines as mathematics, geometry, astronomy, and music. Mathematics, particularly geometry, played a special role. Above the entrance to the academy, according to legend, hung a sign, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." For Plato, mathematics was not just the science of numbers and forms, It was a language that allowed the mind to detach from the sensory world and ascend to the world of ideas, to pure, eternal knowledge. The study of mathematics developed logical thinking, the ability to abstract, and the skill to see truths that do not depend on changing circumstances. The atmosphere at the academy was unique. It was a center for the collaborative search for truth. Students and teachers lived together, discussed philosophical problems, and participated in dialogues and debates, which were the central method of learning. It was a place where thoughts collided, where ideas were born and tested for their strength. There were no rigid lectures in the modern sense. Instead, an atmosphere of intellectual cooperation prevailed, where everyone could contribute to the common search. The academy was not just a school, but a community of like-minded individuals united by a common goal, the cognition of truth and service to the good. It was a space where critical thinking was cultivated, where asking questions, doubting, and seeking answers independently were encouraged. It was here that many eminent philosophers, scientists, and politicians were nurtured, among whom the most famous is Aristotle, a student of Plato, who would later establish his own philosophical school, the Lyceum. The founding of the academy was the culmination of Plato's life experience. It was his way of changing the world, not through revolution, but through the evolution of the mind. He believed that the light of knowledge could dispel the darkness of ignorance, and that education is the most powerful instrument for achieving justice and harmony. Thus, Plato's academy became not just an important educational institution, it became a symbol of faith in the power of reason and in the potential of the human spirit for self-perfection. It was a place where, for centuries, the most profound thoughts were cultivated, where future leaders capable of bearing the light of wisdom were prepared. It was the seed from which the tree of Western civilization grew, and its roots reach back to those ancient Athenian gardens where Plato first gathered his students. We left Plato in his academy, a place where a new educational tradition was being born, where thoughts were being shaped in living discussions. But how did these thoughts reach us? How can we, across millennia, touch his philosophy, if he, unlike many later thinkers, left behind no dry treatises or long scholarly works in the usual sense? The answer lies in his unique choice, the form of the dialogues. Plato chose the form of dialogues for his works for no accidental reason. It was a deeply considered decision, rooted in his experience of conversing with Socrates and in his own philosophical convictions. He did not believe that truth could simply be presented in the form of ready-made statements to be memorized. Instead, he believed that truth is born in the process of a living conversation, when different views collide, are discussed, are subjected to doubt, and ultimately lead to a deeper understanding. This approach was a direct echo of the Socratic method, where questions and answers, irony, and the search for definitions were the key instruments of cognition. Imagine not a lecture, where one speaker monotonously presents material, but a lively conversation, where each participant is an active player. In Plato's dialogues, we see how a thought develops, how arguments appear and are tested, how mistaken notions are destroyed, giving way to truth. This creates a sense of intellectual drama, where the reader or listener becomes not a passive observer, but an active participant in the intellectual quest. It is like watching a dance of the mind, where every word, every line has its own place and meaning. Each of Plato's dialogues is, in essence, a small play, featuring characters with their own personalities, beliefs, and sometimes even flaws. Among them, of course, Socrates most often appears as the main interlocutor, who usually guides the conversation, asking unsettling questions and revealing the contradictions in the thoughts of others. He does not provide ready-made answers, but only helps his companions to find them independently, by first revealing their own ignorance and then their own wisdom. But besides Socrates, other historical figures also take part in the dialogues. Prominent sophists, politicians, young aristocrats, friends, and acquaintances of Plato. Each of them brings their own contribution to the conversation, representing a certain point of view, which Socrates then analyzes and subjects to criticism. The role of these characters extends beyond a simple list of names. They are the living voices of different philosophical views and social positions. This allows Plato to present complex ideas in a more accessible and engaging form. We see how philosophical thought works in action, how it collides with opposing arguments and emerges from them stronger. This metaphor of dialogue as a path to knowledge through questions and answers is key to understanding Plato. For him, cognition is not the accumulation of information, but a process of self-knowledge, constant cleansing of the mind from illusions. Some of the most famous of Plato's dialogues that have come down to us include the Apology of Socrates, where Socrates defends himself before the court, demonstrating his loyalty to the truth. Crito, a conversation about justice and obedience to the laws, even if they are unjust. Phaedo, Socrates' final conversation about the immortality of the soul before his death. The Banquet, or Symposium, profound reflections on the nature of love, Eros, as a striving for beauty and perfection. The Republic, a large-scale dialogue where the ideal structure of the state, justice, the nature of the soul, and the world of ideas are discussed. These works are not just philosophical treatises, they are true literary masterpieces, filled with drama, humor, subtle irony, and deep psychological portraits. Plato's language is distinguished by its elegance and poetic quality, which makes reading him not only an informative, but also an aesthetic pleasure. He masterfully used metaphors, allegory, and myths to make complex philosophical concepts more understandable and vivid. Reading or listening to these dialogues, we feel as though we ourselves become participants in those ancient conversations. We hear the voices, see the emotions, and sense the intellectual tension. This allows the ideas of Socrates and subsequently those of Plato to be more accessible and understandable to readers across the centuries. They invite us to join the eternal search for truth, to join a conversation that began many centuries ago but continues to resonate even today. In this quiet immersion into the world of Plato, we will listen to his dialogues, not as dry texts, but as living voices that tell us of the deepest mysteries of being. This form of presentation allows us to feel not only the intellectual greatness of Plato, but also his humanity, his desire for communication, his faith in the power of the word and of dialogue. It is like listening to an ancient melody, which despite its age is still capable of touching the soul and bestowing a deep sense of peace. We have just immersed ourselves in the world of Plato's dialogues, sensing how truth is born through lively conversations, intellectual debates. This form of expression was not merely a stylistic choice, it reflected the profound essence of Plato's entire philosophy, all-pervading striving for the ideal. It is this very aspiration that, like an invisible thread, runs through his every work, his every thought, his every question that he posed. Plato believed that behind the changing, imperfect world that we perceive with our senses, there exists another world, a world of perfect, unchanging, eternal essences, which he called ideas, or forms. This striving for the ideal was the driving force of his thought. He sought not just knowledge about things, but knowledge about the perfect models of these things. For him, everything that we see in the world is but a pale copy, a shadow of the true reality. For example, when we see a beautiful flower or a beautiful person, we are only sensing an echo of the true absolute. beauty, which exists as an idea in the world of forms. Similarly, when we speak of a just act or a just state, we are attempting to emulate the idea of justice, which is eternal and unchanging. Plato believed that our world, the world of sensory experience, is merely a reflection of this higher ideal world. In his famous myth of the cave, he described this figuratively. Imagine people who have been shackled since childhood in a cave, facing a wall. They see only the shadows of objects being carried behind their back, cast by the light of a fire. These shadows are all they know of the world. But if one of them were to be freed and shown the real objects, and then led out into the sunlight, he would be astounded by true reality. In the same way, according to Plato, we, ordinary people, live in a world of shadows, and only the philosopher, the one who has comprehended the ideas, sees the true light. This striving to leave the cave, to ascend to the light of truth, was central to his philosophy. This striving for perfection permeated Plato on all levels. In morality, he sought the idea of the good as the highest good that should be the goal of all human actions. The good for Plato was not a relative concept, but an absolute truth to which every person should aspire. In beauty, he did not simply appreciate earthly beauty, but saw in it only a stepping stone to the comprehension of absolute beauty, which is eternal and unchanging. It is beauty, in his view, that inspires the soul to seek higher ideas. In the state, Plato saw chaos and injustice in the political systems of his time, particularly in the Athenian democracy that had condemned his teacher Socrates to death. This deep disillusionment prompted him to search for a model of an ideal society where absolute justice would reign, and it was the ideal state that became perhaps the most vivid example of his striving for perfection in the social order. In his most famous work, The Republic, or Politeia, Plato describes in detail what this ideal community should be like. He believed that the state, much like the human soul, must have a harmonious structure. Plato proposed a division of society into three main classes, each corresponding to a certain part of the soul and a certain virtue. Philosopher rulers, the golden class. These are the ones who govern the state. They correspond to the rational part of the soul. These people, by virtue of their education and natural disposition, are able to comprehend the ideas, to see the truth, and therefore to rule wisely and justly. They must be free from private property and family ties, so that their decisions are objective and serve the good of the whole society. Their primary virtue is wisdom, warriors, guardians, the silver class. These are the ones who protect the state from external threats and maintain order within. They correspond to the spirited part of the soul. Their primary virtue is courage. They too must be deprived of private property so that their interests do not conflict with the interests of the state. Artisans and farmers, the bronze class. These are the ones who provide for the material needs of society by producing goods and services. They correspond to the sensory appetitive part of the soul. Their primary virtue is temperance. They may have private property and families, as their activities are not related to governance. This division, according to Plato, was meant to ensure just as everyone does that for which they are best suited, and everyone receives what is due to them. Justice for Plato consisted precisely in the harmonious functioning of all parts of the whole, where each part fulfills its own role. Thus, the ideal state, as the pinnacle of Plato's aspiration, was not just a political utopia. It was an attempt to create a model of society founded on absolute truths, where reason and wisdom reign, where every citizen realizes their potential for the good of the community. This was his answer to the injustice he saw around him, and especially to the tragedy of Socrates. He believed that only in such a state would philosophers not be condemned, on the contrary, would be respected as the most valuable members of society. This striving for the ideal is perhaps the most important feature of Plato's philosophy. It encourages us not to be content with mediocrity, not to reconcile with imperfection, but always to strive for something better, something higher, for that which is true, perfect, and eternal. We have traveled a long path, immersing ourselves in the life of Plato, from his noble birth and fateful meeting with Socrates, the bitterness of disillusionment, and the hope that was embodied in the founding of the Academy and the creation of his immortal dialogues. We have explored his all pervading striving for the ideal, which poured forth into the concept of the world of ideas and the vision of the ideal state. Now the time has come to realize just how immense and all encompassing the influence of this ancient thinker is on our world. Plato, as a foundational philosopher, is a figure who is difficult to overstate. He can boldly be called one of the originators of Western philosophy. There is a famous saying by the English philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, who asserted that all of European philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. This may be an exaggeration, but it perfectly illustrates the central role that Plato plays in the development of philosophical thought. He did not simply formulate certain ideas, he created an entire system of thinking that became the point of departure for countless philosophical movements that arose after him. His student, Aristotle, who criticized many aspects of his teacher's theory, nonetheless built his own philosophy by proceeding from Platonic concepts. Neoplatonism, which flourished in late antiquity, was a direct continuation and reinterpretation of Plato's ideas, adding mystical and religious elements to them. In the Middle Ages, Christian, Islamic, and Judaic thinkers actively turned to Plato. His theory of ideas was exceptionally attractive to theologians, as it provided a philosophical justification for the existence of a transcendent, perfect world, reminiscent of a divine plan or the kingdom of heaven. Many Christian church fathers, notably St. Augustine, were deeply inspired by Plato, integrating his concepts into Christian doctrine. He became an integral part of the foundation of medieval scholastic thought, even if his ideas were often adapted to new religious paradigms. The Renaissance, which marked a return to ancient ideas, rediscovered Plato anew. His works were studied, translated, interpreted, becoming a source of inspiration for artists, poets, and thinkers. The ideas of ideal beauty, of harmony, of the striving for perfection found their reflection in the art of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. They sought the same ideas that Plato did, attempting to embody them in stone, on canvas, and in poetry. Even modern philosophy, science, and culture continue to be in dialogue with Plato, sometimes unconsciously. His concepts, such as the soul, the ideal state, justice, truth, and beauty, have become fundamental categories that we use to make sense of the world. The eternal relevance of Plato's ideas is manifest in many spheres. In politics, although his ideal state was never realized, it remains a powerful benchmark for political thought, reflections on the just structure of society, on the role of the ruler, on the balance between individual and collective interests. All of this is rooted in his Republic. Modern political philosophers, even those who criticize Plato, are still compelled to address his ideas as a starting point for their own arguments. In art, Plato's theory of ideas deeply influenced the understanding of beauty and creativity. The idea that art is merely an imitation mimesis of ideal forms, and not just a copy of reality, shaped aesthetic views for centuries. Many artists strove to reflect in their works not only what they saw, but the ideal essence of their inner perfection. In education, his founding of the academy became the prototype for all future universities. Plato taught that education is not just the transmission of information, but the cultivation of the soul, its reorientation from the world of shadows to the world of light. His emphasis on mathematics as preparation for philosophy, on dialogue as a method of learning, on the harmonious development of the individual, all of this remains relevant even today. In psychology and ethics, Plato's understanding of the soul as a complex structure with three parts, rational, spirited, appetitive, became the basis for many subsequent psychological theories. His reflections on the virtues, wisdom, courage, temperance, justice are still central to ethical philosophy. He posed the questions of how to live virtuously, how to achieve happiness, and what constitutes the true good. Even in the modern world dominated by technology and speed, Plato's ideas continue to live on. We still strive for the ideal in various spheres in science, in design, in social life. We search for truth behind the external appearance of things. We reflect on the nature of knowledge and on how we might better organize our society. Thus, Plato's influence is not confined merely to academic circles. His thoughts have permeated the very fabric of our culture, becoming part of how we think, how we perceive the world, and how we strive for perfection. He is like a bright star that flared up millennia ago and still sends its light, illuminating the path for those who seek wisdom. This legacy is a living one, and it invites us to a constant dialogue, to a constant rethinking, to a constant search for the truth, which, according to Plato, is always waiting for us in the world of ideas.